Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Sojourn in St. Andrews presentation. I'm Elizabeth Wheeler, the Director of Alumni Programs Operations for the MSU Alumni Office, and I'll be your host today. By way of background, here we go. Sojourn in St. Andrews is a brand new program, and it's being modeled after MSU's popular Odyssey to Oxford, which will be celebrating its 37th year in 2021, fingers crossed. The program, the Sojourn in St. Andrews program, will actually be co-hosted by the MSU Alumni Office and the Indiana University Alumni Association. Sojourn in St. Andrews is planned as a one-week lifelong education abroad program during which participants will take one non-credit course of study. To augment the classroom learning, there will also be several excursions in the region that are either course-related or planned for all participants. Sojourn in St. Andrews is planned for June-July of 2022, and it will be open to all alumni and friends of MSU and IU, but do note that space will be limited. At this time, we only have the program information that I'm presenting now, but we do anticipate having more details in the spring of 2021. So if you are interested in the program for June-July of 2022, please contact me via email, and that's on the screen, and I'll also provide that in a follow-up email shortly. I would also be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to promote both IU and MSU's alumni travel programs. Both of these programs offer domestic and international travel opportunities that introduce guests to each destination's social, cultural, and recreational activities. If you're thinking about traveling in 2021, check out the destinations and consider joining a tour. So, on to the real reason many of you are joining us this morning. It's our presentation on Scottish history and culture. This presentation actually came about due to the pandemic, and when the pandemic forced us to postpone the program launch to 2022, St. Andrews reached out to us and proposed a series of presentations in anticipation of the program. We've had an overwhelming response to this first one, and that actually brings me to my first poll question of the day. It should be popping up on your screen now, and that question is, why did you register for today's presentation? And you can choose as many options as you'd like. Devante, do we have our results? Okay, well that's really, wow. A lot of you love haggis, myself included. I actually would answer all of them except for number 3. In fact, I actually broke out one of my family tartans for today. Here we go, everybody, it's excited. I know it's loud, it's 10 o'clock in the morning, it might be a little too bright for your eyes, but this is MacLeod of Lewis. And so shout out if I have any relatives in the audience. Email me afterwards, we can chat. So, okay, before we get started, actually, a little bit of housekeeping. The format for today is a 60-minute presentation followed by 30 minutes of Q&A. We do encourage you to submit your questions throughout the presentation, and you can do so by utilizing the Q&A icon, which is located in the tool ribbon. I'll be collecting the questions throughout the presentation, and we will do our best to address them during the Q&A segment. Also, we are recording the presentation, and it will be available in our live stream archive on the MSU Alumni Office website within 1 week. I will be sure to include a link to the archive in my follow-up email as well. So, on to today's presentation. Our speaker is Gary Mackenzie. Gary is an academic poet, let's start this again. Gary is an academic, poet, and nonfiction writer based in Fife, Scotland. He tutors in English and creative writing at the University of St. Andrews and the University for the Creative Arts, and has led residential summer courses for Smithsonian Journeys. He is the author of Scotland, a literary guide for travelers, and his book-length poem, Ben Dorain, A Conversation with a Mountain, is due to be published this month. He has published widely in the fields of contemporary and Scottish literature, and his research interests include literary engagements with environmental issues and the relationships between place, political identity, and language in Scottish literature. His poetry has won awards, including the Wigtown International Poetry Prize and a Scottish New Writers Award. Welcome, Gary, and with that, I'll turn it over to you for battles, migrations, and the Loch Ness Monster.
Brilliant, thank you, Elizabeth. It's really great to be speaking to you this morning. It's one of those wonders of the internet that I can be with you wherever you are. Today, there is a slight bittersweet kind of feeling to that, in that we're just doing it remotely. I'm not able to be speaking to you in person. It'd be wonderful to be with you in a lecture theatre in Michigan, or indeed for you to be in St Andrews, for me to be able to welcome you to Scotland. And I hope to be able to do that at some point in the future for as many of you as possible. The other thing with not doing this in person is that there's an additional risk. This is a very mild trigger warning that since I'm in my own home, my cat might make an appearance at any moment. I'll try not to get him on screen. He is prone to typing as well. So any strange typing comes up in the chat, it's the cat, I think, that's responsible for that. So as Elizabeth said, my main interest and expertise is in literature, including Scottish literature. And today I'm going to introduce you to a few famous Scottish writers, some who you may well have heard of, who are kind of Scotland's world famous exports, I guess, in a way, and also perhaps some that are more off the beaten track, especially some contemporary writers. And I'm not just going to be talking about literature. I'm going to be using literature as a lens through which to look a little bit at Scottish history, at some of the most important events in Scottish history, some things which you've perhaps heard of but don't know how to place within the scheme of the development of Scotland as a country. And we'll see where we go from there. As Elizabeth said, there'll be half an hour for questions at the end. I'm really happy to field any questions, whether about something that I've mentioned during the talk, or something I haven't mentioned, something you want me to go into more detail on, or any general unfinished business or curiosity you have about Scottish culture, Scottish society, Scottish politics. Let me just share my slides as we get going. So I'd like to start by sharing a modern Scottish poem with you today. It's by a poet called Edwin Morgan. This is him here. Edwin Morgan died about 10 years ago, born in 1920. And he's one of those poets, I'm sure there are American poets of a similar kind of standing, who's really a household name by the standards of poetry, the sort of person that kids read at school, whether they want to or not, that becomes a public figure, a popular figure that people have, heard of, that it's reported on the news when they pass away, all that kind of thing. Really kind of well-known Scottish literature figure of the last 100 years. And in since 1986, in London, there's been a series which some of you might have come across called Poets on the Underground, or Poetry on the Underground, where in the underground trains in London, they invited poets to contribute poems which would be up in the sort of regular advertising spaces at the top of each carriage. So, you're on the way to the dentist or you're on the way to the office, and instead of looking up and seeing some extortionate insurance or the latest car that will change your life, instead you can read a poem and have this kind of edifying experience that's good for the soul. And they invited Edwin Morgan to contribute a poem. The poem which I'm going to share with you is the poem that he had printed in the Poems in the Underground series. It's called the Loch Ness Monster song. Now, you might have heard of the Loch Ness Monster, but if you haven't, here's a picture. This is one of the few known sightings of it as a creature. It's a mythical beast, probably descended from the dinosaurs. And before I go on, just while we've got this picture on screen, it's a poor quality picture. That's not a problem with any of our computers. It's just a fact of it being a photograph. Most photographs of the Loch Ness Monster are very poor quality. That's possibly to hide the fact that the species or the genus of this creature is almost certainly tractor tire. You know, it's blurry for a good reason. Anyway, the Loch Ness Monster is an underwater creature. It lives in a lake in the Scottish Highlands called Loch Ness. Loch is the Scottish word for lake. Here's a picture of Loch Ness. Loch Ness is very deep. It's deeper than the North Sea, the sea to the east of Scotland, between Scotland and Scandinavia. So it's only very recently, in the last small number of years, that researchers could actually study the bottom of Loch Ness and chart the deepest parts of it. Here's Loch Ness on a map of Scotland, just to give you a little indication. So it's 2/3 of the way north in the country. St Andrews, where I'm calling from today, is on the peninsula just below the Monster's tail. That little peninsula that kind of almost looks like a Scotty dog facing to the right. It's where I am. And there are stories about the Loch Ness Monster going right back hundreds of years. There's a story that Saint Columba, one of the first Christian saints of Scotland, who was alive about 1400 years ago, he had an encounter with the Loch Ness Monster. He was traveling along the banks of the loch with some of his monks and some of his attendants. The monster came out of the water and attacked one of his followers, and Columba rebuked the monster in the name of God, and it swam off and was not to be seen again for hundreds of years. But interest in the monster really, in a big way, took off in the 19th century, alongside the rise of newspapers, the rise of everyone, people being largely literate and having access to newspapers, and then eventually photographs and other imagery, being printed in newspapers. Newspapers are a great way to spread rumors of the monster's existence as this animal living in the deep water of Loch Ness. Now, the thing about the Loch Ness Monster is he's all alone. It's thought there's only a single male Loch Ness Monster swimming around and around in search of a mate for all eternity, for millions of years, if it's descended from the dinosaurs, perhaps. And to this day, and this thing I'm going to tell you is actually true, to this day, there are people dedicated to keeping up year-round surveillance of the surface of the water in Loch Ness in the hope that the creature raises its head above water. In the past, a team of hardy individuals kept their telescopes constantly trained on the water, and now there's webcams doing a very similar thing, giving the world a chance to look out for Nessie. So see if you can track down one of those if you want to be the one that solves the mystery and discovers this creature. Here's a quote. This is from the Atlantic magazine. It's an article written by John McPhee, who you might have heard of. He wrote for the Atlantic. He wrote for the New Yorker for many years. And he in 1970, or in the late 60s into 1970, interviewed people on the banks of Loch Ness who were there with their telescopes and their cameras. And one of the members of the Loch Ness Phenomena Investigation Bureau, this kind of vigilante look out for the monster organization, he says this: "I shall never rest peacefully until I know what it is. Some of the largest creatures in the world are out there, and we can't name them. It may take 10 years, but we're going to identify the species. Most people are not as fanatical as I, but I would like to see this through to the end if I don't run out of money first." A couple of good points in there. I think the first is it may take 10 years, but we're going to identify the species. The species has still not been identified 50 years later. And, I'm not the bank manager for this guy who provided the quote, but I suspect he ran out of money first, to be honest. Here's another known sighting of the Loch Ness Monster. And I'm going to open a link to a recording of Edwin Morgan reading his Loch Ness Monster poem. Now, I hope this sound shares with you okay. I'm sure someone will tell me if it doesn't, and then I'll be on the spot and I'll need to read the poem myself. What I'd like you to do, just for a moment, while I'm loading this and while you listen to the poem, I'd like you to close your eyes and imagine you're on the banks of Loch Lomond. It's a beautiful day. The sun is shining, unusually for Scotland, and suddenly some bubbles appear on the surface of the loch, and then some ripples getting bigger and bigger, and then this huge leathery reptilian head comes above the surface of the water, and the eyes turn and turn and turn until it's looking straight at you, and then the monster starts to speak. Edwin Morgan's poem is the words which the monster says directly to you. Here's Edwin Morgan.
The Loch Ness Monster song. Snowwaffle, snowwaffle, waffle, waffle, drubble, bubble, hum, gobble, 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 gobble. Drubble, half lub, half gub, huffle, huffle, full, full. Gruff, gruff, off gum, grogum. Overplodok, doppledovok, plovedocket, doppledokush, sgrof, walk, scratch, hash, gabble, gabble, fox, fok, zgra, kra, ga, fok, gruff, gaff, gumble, bloom, 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 bloom.
Okay, brilliant. So that was the Loch Ness Monster song read by Edwin Morgan. I'm glad I didn't have to read it out myself, but I'll show you the words of the poem here. This is not my cat typing on the screen. This is the actual words of Loch Ness Monster song. So you heard it correctly if you heard it something like this from the recording. And what on earth is this? What on earth just happened? What did you just hear? And why, out of all the things I could possibly share with you to start a talk on Scottish history, culture, and literature, did I go for this? Okay, so first thing to say with this is we're imagining this is a poem in the voice of the Loch Ness Monster. What might the Loch Ness Monster sound like if he was speaking? So Edwin Morgan is trying to imagine the sound of the Loch Ness Monster's language. And the monster's speech sounds quite like a creature trying to speak with a mouthful of water. He's just come up from underwater. He's trying to speak in the open air. So the snuffle, muffle, muffle, grub, 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 grub kind of sounds and early on in the poem. Imagine that is a creature trying to speak to you with a mouthful of water. For anyone that remembers Stingray, the kind of sort of animated with puppets kind of TV show, it's maybe a bit like the bad guys in Stingray, the way that the Loch Ness Monster speaks. And this is a legitimate kind of poetry in a way. It's an avant-garde genre of poetry called sound poetry. The idea behind this is a popular genre in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, experimental kind of era in poetry and literature. The idea is that what if we make a poem that sounds a little bit more like music, where we're not thinking of words having direct meanings, we're not communicating a meaning in the way we usually use with language, but we want to convey something through sound, through rhythm, all those kinds of things. And for that reason, you don't need to necessarily translate every word of this into something that makes sense to you. But on the other hand, I think there are some things we can figure out from it. You know, if we were all sitting together around a seminar table, we'd maybe have an interesting discussion of this. But I just want to point out a couple of things. Firstly, there's punctuation. There are question marks. That means the monster's asking questions. I think he's asking you a question as you hear him speaking to you. He seems rather annoyed. There are a lot of exclamation marks. You'll notice in the second half of the poem, there are a few things which might translate quite easily into a four-letter word in English. I think he's cursing, he's annoyed. I think he's looking for a companion. He's asking you, have you seen anyone a bit like me? And when he doesn't get an answer, he's cross, he's annoyed, and gives up in disgust. In the middle of in the longest line of the poem, he says, "How a plodoc, doppeldocosh." I think he's looking for a diplodocus, a kind of species of dinosaur with a big long neck and a small head, a bit like he is. And then the final lines are interesting. You might have noticed when Edwin Morgan read them aloud that it sounds rather like bubbles or someone going back underwater again. You know, he's descending until all we're left with is the bubbles of his breath breaching the surface. Okay, now not all of Edwin Morgan's poems are like this. There's a large variety to his work. He writes conventional sonnets and love poems. He writes riddles. He writes kind of joke and nonsense poems. And this is maybe an outlier to his work. And you might be wondering, yeah, why I chose this poem to start with. Surely it's too unusual, too much of an outlier to be typical of anything, let alone anything that this talk is meant to be about on. But although it's quirky and maybe different from any other poetry that you might have read, I want to make a bold claim, and that claim is that in many ways, this poem is completely typical of Scottish literature and perhaps Scottish culture more generally. I'm going to spend the rest of this lecture trying to convince you some of the reasons why I've made that claim. Why do I want to argue this? Well, let's look at some reasons. And the first reason I want to share with you is the Loch Ness Monster song is not a straightforward use of one language. It seems to be a combination of English with a mysterious underwater tongue spoken by the monster. And Scottish culture in general is made up of a range of languages. Not many people are fluent in Loch Monsterese, the dialect which this creature seems to be speaking, but often the language that ordinary Scots speak or the language that they write is not quite standard English. And I want to look at that in more detail. Today there are three main languages of Scotland, each of which has been around for at least a few hundred years. I'm leaving aside language which have become more common in recent years due to migration from Europe and beyond, although those are becoming increasingly important in modern Scotland. But the three traditional languages over the last few hundred years I'm sharing in this image now, this map of Scotland. This shows the distribution of three languages. Don't worry if this map doesn't make too much sense at the moment. We'll return to it in a little while. But it's just to flag up regional distribution of a few different languages across time in Scotland. The first language I want to talk about is blue on this map is Gaelic. I should say before I go on, the bottom left of this map, that's Northern Ireland, which has a lot of linguistic and cultural things in common with Scotland. So Gaelic, the first language I want to mention, it's spoken in the country of the island of Ireland from at least the 2nd century AD. It's a Celtic language. The Celts migrated to the northwest of Europe, probably from Central Europe, over many centuries, and particularly around about the time of the Roman Empire. And then from about the 5th century, with a few settlements beforehand, but from the 5th century in particular AD, people from Ireland started colonizing Scotland. They started traveling there and bringing their language with them. Confusingly, these people were called Scots. Before these people from Ireland came to Scotland, Scotland was not known as Scotland, and it did not have people in it called Scots. So the Scots are immigrants, essentially, to the land, and the name is stuck for people that from the country of all backgrounds now. That's the word that's used. Before the Scots arrived in Scotland, there were other groups such as the Picts and the Britons, and also people from the Roman Empire living in the territory. The established kingdoms, once they settled, the Irish, particularly in the west coast, some of the islands, you'll see the west coast of Scotland is very fragmented, a lot of islands, a lot of peninsulas, a lot of watery inlets. In the medieval world, that was great because the sea was the way you traveled between places. It was the highway of its time. Inland was much more difficult. There weren't really very many roads. You'd be traveling through thick forests, or you'd be traveling over mountains or quite inhospitable territory. So the sea connected you with places, and all the west coast of Scotland is now thought of as a little bit remote, a little bit isolated. In the medieval world, it was a hub, really, a very international, cosmopolitan place with a lot of travel other parts of Europe. And one of the settlers from Ireland in Scotland was this gentleman here on the left, St. Columba. He was an Irish priest, originally a prince, gave up his royal title in order to join the church. He arrived in Scotland in 563 AD and eventually established a monastery on the island of Iona, one of the islands on the west coast of Scotland. This is a sort of modern building on Iona, the modern abbey on Iona, sort of properly built in the 19th into the 20th century, but it's round about the place that Columba set up his base of operations, and from there he spread Christianity to a lot of Scotland overall. And the monasteries and the society they brought with them was very important in the Middle Ages in Scotland. Really important cultural centre. It's where books were written, books were copied out. You might have heard of the Book of Kells, a wonderful illuminated edition of the Gospels. It's in Ireland, but it was probably started, it took many years to complete. It was probably started in Iona and moved to Kells, a monastery called Kells in Ireland, because of Viking raids. It was moved there to keep it safe. It was such a precious artifact, and it's now, you know, one of the great treasures of Irish history. Although it probably started at Columba's monastery in Iona. Columba was a priest, but he was also a poet. And one of the oldest poems in Scottish literature is a hymn in praise of creation, a hymn in praise of God, written by Columba. And this is probably where my little introduction there about 3 languages in Scotland comes across its first challenge. It's actually more complex than that, because Columba, being a churchman, was writing in Latin. He spoke Gaelic, he spoke Irish language, but he also spoke and wrote in Latin, the international language of its time. Here's part of his poem, The Maker on High, as it would be translated in English. I'll just read the first stanza of it, just to give you a sense of it. Ancient exalted seed scatterer, whom time gave no progenitor. He knew no moment of creation in his primordial foundation. He is and will be all places and all times and all ages. With Christ as firstborn, only born, and the Holy Spirit co-born, throughout the high eternity of glorious divinity, 3 gods we do not promulgate, 1 God we state and intimate, Salvific faith victorious, 3 persons very glorious. It's a big trumpet blast fanfare kind of poem, this, and as you might get a sense just from this slide, it goes through the alphabet. It's an acrostic. Each verse, each stanza starts with a different letter of the alphabet. So, you know, it's a great virtuosic feat to be able to do that in a poem, and for it to be translated into English as well is a big feat. The more keen-eyed of you might recognize this as the structure of Psalm 119. It's a Hebrew acrostic starting with each stanza starts with a different letter of the Hebrew alphabet. So it's, you know, God is Alpha and Omega. Let's have a poem that does a very similar kind of thing. And eventually the Irish culture spread all the way across Scotland from the west coast, the political culture as well as the church. Gradually the sort of settler colony kingdoms which were established on the west coast absorbed the whole of basically the landmass of modern Scotland, certainly the mainland. And after about 800 AD, they had the Irish Scots were the governing power throughout Scotland. And to this day, many places across the country have Gaelic place names. Those place names will come from that period in history. And the language has evolved. It's a Celtic language, and it evolved from Irish, but Scottish Gaelic is now slightly different from Irish Gaelic, not least in the fact that you pronounce the name of the language slightly differently. It's probably an equivalent might be the difference between European Spanish and South American Spanish. They're similar. Speakers could probably understand each other pretty well, but there are differences, and they've evolved along separate lines. And today it's a minority language. According to the last national census in 2011, there were 57,000 speakers of Gaelic in a population of 5.25 million, so very small numbers. And this is partly because of historical persecution and partly because of the outcome of one of the big events in Scottish history, the Jacobite Uprising of 1745. So to let me to explain the effects of that, I need to give you a little bit of history and backtrack just a little bit. So Scotland from the Middle Ages onwards was a separate country from England. We're now part of the same country, the United Kingdom. We're separate countries until in 1603, Scotland and England shared a king. They were still separate countries, but with the same head of state, the same king. It was after Elizabeth I died and was replaced or followed by James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. And then in 1707, just over 100 years later, Scotland and England joined into the same country. The aristocrats and the nobles of Scotland had tried to set up a colony in modern-day Panama. It failed miserably, and they basically bankrupted themselves and bankrupted the nation. And when they did that, they needed help. And the way they solved that was to join with England into the country of Great Britain, as it was then. It became the United Kingdom in the 19th century when Ireland was incorporated into it. And so Scotland and England, part of the same country from 1707, Great Britain, and the Scottish line of kings and queens had become the heads of state of this new country. But, as you'll know, Over this period, there are immense sectarian struggles and Reformation struggles in Britain and across Europe. The Stuarts, James I and his family, were some of them were Catholic. The last of whom was James II, um, the son of Charles I, the king who was executed in the revolution in the middle of the 17th century. And James II was deposed. He wasn't overthrown in a revolution as such. It's called the Glorious Revolution because it was very unviolent, very peaceful. He basically invited to leave, you know, with some coercion. And he was deposed in 1688, and a new Protestant royal dynasty was invited to take over. In 1745, there was an attempt to reinstate James II's family as the royal family of Great Britain. It was one of his descendants, Bonnie Prince Charlie, Charles Edward Stuart. He is here as a young man, handsome young man. As an old man, he didn't age terribly well, partly because of the failure of his attempt to go onto the royal throne. You'll now see his grave is inside St. Peter's in the Vatican. You might notice it there because he spent his life in exile after the failed attempt to take the throne of Great Britain. The rebellion to install him as king started in the Highlands of Scotland, which was remote and difficult for the government to control, a logical place to start your uprising. It wasn't, however, a war of Scotland against England, which is sometimes what the Jacobite Uprising is described as. It was really a power struggle and a religious struggle, where the nobles and influential figures in the country who supported Catholic heads of state, who supported the Stuart family, were behind him, and those who supported the new status quo, the Protestant Hanoverian dynasty of kings and queens, fought against. So that divided Scotland as well as the UK overall. Ultimately, this uprising was defeated in 1746 at the Battle of Culloden. Culloden is quite near Loch Ness in the Scottish Highlands. And the uprising had a few consequences. Firstly, there were repercussions for the nobles that had supported Bonnie Prince Charlie. They lost power, many of them. But there was also a real attempt to make sure this kind of uprising never happened again by suppressing the culture which had supported it the most, which was the Gaelic Highland culture in Scotland. So certain things were outlawed, certain things were banned. Gaelic-speaking people were not allowed to gather in large groups. There was a sort of curfew there. They were not allowed to play bagpipes. That was thought of as a very military kind of musical instrument, a provocative thing to do. They weren't allowed to wear tartan. Elizabeth would not have been able to wave her family tartan in the introduction. That was outlawed for a while. The carrying of weapons was banned at a time when that's not a common thing in Britain now, but in the 18th century, people traveling, especially in the Highlands, would always have been armed. That was banned in this region. And these things were particularly associated with Gaelic culture. So the restrictions, according to many historians, were an attempt to undermine the distinctive culture of northern Scotland, which had some differences from the rest of Great Britain. And from the 18th century onwards, the Gaelic language was actively discouraged in education. I learned a little bit of Gaelic in an evening class from a woman who'd grown up on the Isle of Harris in the Western Isles of Scotland in the 1940s. That was one of the Gaelic-speaking heartlands of the country. But when she went to primary school, aged 5 or 6, until that time, she only spoke Gaelic and spoke Gaelic at home with her family. As soon as she went into education, into school, she was forbidden from speaking Gaelic. The children of the area were punished, would have been hit with a ruler on the hand or whatever if they'd been heard speaking Gaelic, even in the playground. They had to switch to English. It's only the last few decades that has changed, and are now Gaelic language schools in Scotland, and you can do a degree in Gaelic and all the rest of it. But it's still treated with suspicion by many Scots. The Scots who are very against Scottish independence, maybe a topic we can discuss in the questions afterwards, but people who are against independence think that anything to do with Gaelic smacks of Scottish nationalism, smacks of something just different from the British mainstream, and therefore is to be mistreated. So one thing that really annoys people, this might sound silly, is this: Gaelic or bilingual road signs. This the yellow, orangey yellow here is Gaelic, and then the white underneath is the exact same thing in English. And a lot of people are very resistant to these, say they're a waste of the taxpayers' money, and they're just a kind of covert way of pushing favour for Scottish nationalism via Gaelic. Most Gaelic speakers wouldn't say that. You know, they just say that they're grateful for any recognition their language might get. Let me just briefly show you another example of Gaelic, not a road sign. This one is a poem by a contemporary Gaelic poet called Meg Bateman, who lives on the Isle of Skye. And I really just wanted to show you this just to give you a look at what Gaelic looks like. It's incredibly different from English. It doesn't have the same origins in any way. You can see here it's very separate. And what's interesting about it is that in Gaelic, people don't generally invent new words. So anytime we need a new word for something in Gaelic, what happens is it's a phonetic Gaelic version of the English. So the word for television in Gaelic is television. The word for radio in Gaelic is radio. They're just spelt slightly differently. You'll see the words tower blocks and motorways in the second half of this poem are the same. And sepia, the sort of brown color of old photographs as well. So for people that don't speak Gaelic, it means Gaelic can be treated almost comically because it sounds so different, incomprehensible to many people, and then suddenly there'll be one word which is recognizable to everyone who speaks English, and then it'll go back into Gaelic again. Okay, let's go on to the second language which I want to talk about today, and we'll cover a little bit more history through that, which is Scots. So look back at this map. Scots. What is Scots? Is it the same as English? It's a very fraught question. It's perhaps not a language which you'll have directly heard of. You might have no notion that they could be considered a language at all. Excuse me. So Scots has its origins in Old English, which came to Great Britain from North Germany with various tribes, the Angles and the Saxons, who migrated in the middle of the first millennium to Great Britain. But it also has influences from Scandinavia, from Norse-speaking people, many of whom have settled over hundreds of years in Scotland. Vikings or the Norse cultures ruled quite a few different regions of Scotland, especially the islands to the north, which are yellow in this map, and the islands to the west about 1,000 years ago, they ruled as well, and some of the coastal regions as well. And Scots emerged out of, evolved out of kind of Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian language. It's very similar to English in some senses. There's lots of Scottish vocabulary or Scots vocabulary that doesn't exist in mainstream English. And if you cross the border and go into England, you'll very quickly come across people who are completely puzzled by Scottish words. There are differences in grammar too. And this question of difference and similarity is another of those fraught political questions now, a bit like Gaelic road signs. The people who say Scots is sufficiently different from English to be called a language of its own, tend to be people who are supportive of Scottish independence or Scotland being culturally different from the rest of the United Kingdom. People who describe it as a dialect of English, just like Cockney might be, or a dialect from Liverpool or Newcastle or Yorkshire. Those people would say, of course, Scots isn't a language, it's just a dialect. It's just one other region of the same island of Great Britain. And Scots has quite a bit of history, and from all ends of the social spectrum, which are interesting to look at. We'll just very briefly do that. So about 700 years ago, a little over 700 years ago, Scots fairly decisively won a series of wars of independence, led by figures you'll have heard of, such as William Wallace. I heard they made a movie about him, and Robert the Bruce, who was the first king after the wars of independence. He won the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, which sort of decisively ended English attempts to control Scotland and make it a sort of vassal state of Scotland. For several hundred years after that, Scotland and England were separate countries. They would occasionally go to war with each other. I've heard a story, I've not been able to back up this fact with proof, but I've heard that Berwick, which is a town very near the Scottish-English border, is the town, apart from Jerusalem, it is the town which has changed hands the most due to conflict in history. No idea if that's actually true, but it's an interesting kind of statistic to chew over. Scotland had its own alliances with different countries in Europe. You might have heard of the Auld Alliance, an alliance that Scotland had with France. They basically, neither country liked England very much, so they said, let's be buddies together and give England grief on both sides, from the north and the south. Some would argue there's a legacy of Scotland being quite, allied or pro-European even till today. In the referendum for Brexit in 2016, most Scots voted to stay in the European Union. That's not the case south of the border in England or in Wales. So there's maybe a different way of thinking about Europe in Scotland to some extent, and maybe some of that comes from history. And there was a flourishing in this independent Scotland of the late Middle Ages. There was a flourishing of Scottish society and culture and literature around about the time of these two monarchs here. James IV, King of Scotland until 1513, and Mary, Queen of Scots, one of the most famous rulers of Scotland, who was queen later in the century. You'll see that she didn't end her reign when she died. She was deposed. She lived semi-imprisoned or just basically imprisoned in England for a while. Queen Elizabeth I worried that Mary had a pretty tangible claim on the English throne and eventually had her executed. But during these monarchs' rule, it was a sort of golden age of Scottish culture. James's father, as a wedding gift, was given by the King of France a cannon, the largest cannon, one of the largest cannons in Europe at the time. A great kind of wedding present. It almost seems like being given a nuclear bomb or something would be for your wedding. Just to give you a sense of the diplomacy with which James's family, the Stuarts, kind of were linked with a lot of other European countries. Both of these monarchs wrote poetry. They wrote literature. It was a mark of their social accomplishments at the time. But they also supported the arts. And under James in particular, there was a great flourishing of poetry in Scots. And if you read it, it's very different from English. I'm not going to share any of it with you now, but you would struggle to say that this is definitely the English language. You'd say it's something a little bit different. The most famous example of it, or one of the most interesting examples of it, is Gavin Douglas, who was a clergyman who completed the first translation of Virgil's Aeneid from Latin into a vernacular European language, so into a regular, everyday European language. He completed that in 1513 and added some embellishments, added some original stuff of his own. Some people say it's one of the most influential translations of Virgil's Aeneid into any language from the Latin. And it's maybe a sign of the cultural self-confidence at the time, also the cosmopolitanism of the time, that people are translating into Scots from European languages, and they're translating great works of European literature into Scots, and discussing them on their own terms, in their own language. By the 17th century, I said that Scotland unified with England to form Great Britain in 1707. By that stage, Scots was falling out of fashion at court. It remained the language of ordinary folk, especially in the countryside, but became increasingly seen as an unsophisticated, rural kind of language, or the language later of the urban working class as well. It thrived in folk culture. Here's an example of a ballad. The Scots language, one of its cultural high points is what are called the border ballads, ballads that were collected from Scottish borders. These were narrative poems. They were stories. They were written to be sung often. They're generally anonymous. They don't come from lofty, powerful people. They're part of an oral culture that was passed on person to person, and often woman to woman. This is not really the kind of male-dominated establishment literature. It's something that resided in a different part of society. Let me just let you hear what the start of this poem sounds like. It's you'll get a sense of the translations on the right. You have two crows, two corbies, looking at a dead knight and debating which part of the corpse they want to eat first. The border ballads are famous for their gruesome, sort of unflinching subject matter and their sort of dark, gothic kind of tone. The twa corbies. As I was walking all alane, I heard twa corbies macking a main. The ane unto the other say, "Warsaw we gang and dine the day. In a hint on old failed dyke, what there lies in Eustlain night, and named the ken that he lies there, with his hawk, his hound, and his lady fair. He'll sit on his white haw's bane, and I'll pike out his bonny blue een, we'll lock his gowden hair, he'll thick your nest when it grows bare. Okay, so quite an ominous kind of dark tone there, something about mortality, something about these sort of brave young knights just becoming food for the birds like everything else does ultimately. That's classic border ballad territory. And it's a way in which a culture is reflecting upon deep questions, I think, questions about life and death, questions about family, questions about relationships, questions about oneself. In general, there was a decline in Scots poetry as it became increasingly unfashionable. There was a renaissance under this man here, someone you'll, I imagine many of you will have heard of, Robert Burns, who lived in the late 18th century, rural Ayrshire, the southwest of Scotland was where he was from. He was portrayed as the heaven-taught ploughman, this kind of rural labourer who miraculously had a gift of poetry. That was a very upper-class kind of marketing of him. He was actually someone who, for his time and for his class, was very well educated, and his poems became immensely popular in his own lifetime, and then over the last couple of hundred years have become one of Scotland's big cultural exports, especially popular with people who emigrated from Scotland. He was a very tangible piece of Scottish culture that people could take with them when they went abroad. People like John Muir or Andrew Carnegie, both Scots who emigrated to the United States and had a huge influence in the United States in very different ways. Both of them would swear by the copy of Burns that they took with them. He was one of the people that their family knew of and read. You know, you'd have a copy of Burns and you'd have a copy of the Bible, and that was probably your family book collection at the time. Here's a little extract from one of his poems, just to give you a sense of it. It's a poem that's kind of in the border ballad tradition. It's a very dark Gothic tale, like the two Corbies. It's called Tam O'Shanter. It's a longish poem in which a man has gone to market. He's got drunk in a tavern after he's sold his wares, and he's riding home on a dark and stormy night, and he stops at a ruined church. It's a real ruined church that you can visit to this day. Looks in the window, and he sees the devil having a barn dance, basically. The devil is having a dance with a load of witches and warlocks. The devil, gloriously, the most Scottish thing ever, the devil is the one playing the bagpipes in the corner. And all these witches and ghouls and evil spirits are dancing. They're having what's called a ceilidh dance, a Scottish traditional dance. And Tam is looking in at this sight in these lines here. As Tammy glowered, amazed and curious, the mirth and fun grew fast and furious. The piper loud and louder blew, the dancers quick and quicker flew. They reeled, they set, they crossed, they cleek it, till ilka carlin swat and reek it, and coosed her duddies on the wark, and link it at it in her sark. It's wonderful, vigorous poetry. It's difficult not to read it faster and faster and louder as you're reading it aloud. It has a lot of energy to it, and that's one of the things that people have loved about the poem. But it also switches, as I hope you can see. The first half of it is pretty familiar English. It's not challenging language whatsoever. The second half, it's like it switches almost into a different language, and that's very typical of Scots as a language. People speak it to some extent, but they don't speak it exclusively, and they'll throw Scottish words and Scottish phrases into everyday speech in English. It's especially become the language of emotion, the language of the home, the language of having fun, the language of sentimentality, whereas people would speak a more formal English when they're in education, when they're doing business, I don't know, when they're at a wedding or a funeral, any kind of formal occasion like that. And many Scots are capable of switching. There's a professor in St Andrews, Robert Crawford, an expert in Scottish literature, who describes the Scots as being between languages. I think that's quite a good way to put it. A lot of Scots are able to switch and will adjust their language between Scots and English depending on the situation they're in. And that's come out of history. That's come out of the ways in which Scotland as a country has changed over time. Okay, I've talked about two languages so far, Gaelic and Scots. I've not talked about the most obvious language yet, which pretty much everyone in Scotland will speak today, which is English. As Scots declined over the last 400 or 500 years, English has been on the rise, and Scots in turn have had a big influence on what we sometimes think of as English literature in English. In the 18th century, James Boswell, a Scot, wrote the first modern biography of a living figure, Samuel Johnson, a great man of letters from England. Before that, people wrote hagiography, really a celebration of someone's life, whereas he was interested in the psychology of the person he was writing about, and that changed the way people thought about biography. In the early 19th century, Sir Walter Scott invented the historical novel. He invented novels in which an individual is caught up in tumultuous times in their country's past, as a way of thinking about how we came to be as we are now as a society. That's a template which has had a huge influence on later literature. Something like War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy very much is in the mold of Walter Scott's historical fiction. I recently taught a class on Edith Wharton's novel, The Age of Innocence, American novel about New York high society in the 1870s. In a way, it's a similar thing. You have individuals caught up in a society at a time in the past as a way of thinking about where were we as a country then, where are we as a country now. Later in the 19th century, after Walter Scott, towards the end of the century, you have Robert Louis Stevenson writing in English. He gave Western culture, not just Scotland, but Western culture, two of its most iconic fictional tales. First of all, Jekyll and Hyde, this, the tale which I'm sure you'll know of, split personality, someone being a respectable gentleman in society by day, and then at night becoming a different person, a person that indulges in all sorts of vices and violence and so on. And the other great contribution Stevenson made, I'm saying great, I'll leave you to make up your own mind, is Treasure Island. He essentially made pirates in literature cool, pirates interesting. He's behind, if you go look back long enough, he's behind the sort of Pirates of the Caribbean movies and the great kind of Treasure Island movies of the 20th century. His novel was one of the first to kind of make that an exciting, adventurous topic for children to read about. Today, in Scottish literature, crime writing is one of its big international draws. Writers like Val McDermott and Ian Rankin sell internationally, and they're part of what's sometimes called tartan noir, dark, hard-boiled crime from Scotland. But to show you a little brief example of a Scottish writer who's writing in English, but with a little Scots inflection to it, I'd like to look at a different writer. It's this woman here, Jackie Kay. She was born in 1961. She's a poet and a memoirist and a fiction writer. She is, at the moment, Scotland's Makar. Makar is the Scots word for bard, for poet. She's essentially the poet laureate of Scotland for another year, I think, until her term ends. And I'm going to show you a very brief extract from one of her short stories. It's called How to Get Away with Suicide. It's about a man called Malcolm, or Malky, from Glasgow. His life is going badly. As the title might suggest, he's thinking about killing himself. And then he starts thinking, if I kill myself, who's going to look after the dog? And if I kill myself, I better tidy the house first. I better do the vacuuming first, or else, people will judge me badly for not, keeping the house spick and span. And by the end of the story, it might not surprise you. I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say he thinks life is actually worth living, and he's, happier at the end of the story. But here, interestingly, is how he thinks about language. Two Scots words in it, which I've glossed at the bottom. Now he is not getting to see his bairns. He says the word bairns when he's full of self-pity, because it brings him close to tears. He likes a word that makes him greet. Okay, so the words bairns and greet mean children and cry. They're both Scots words. Bairns in particular, you might have come across outside of Scotland. But this is quite typical. I said Scots is the language of home and family and sentiment. That's what's happening here. Where he's getting a bit sentimental, a bit maudlin, he uses a word like greet or cry. He wouldn't use that in a formal setting. That's him using it in a much more intimate, personal kind of way. going to briefly, in the final 5 minutes before I finish up, I'd like to take you along a different direction. Remind you that I started with a kind of gambit that the Loch Ness Monster song was fairly typical of Scottish literature and Scottish culture and maybe Scottish history. We've talked about the 3 languages of Scotland. The Loch Ness Monster song is linguistically complex, and I think in some ways it's a little nod. I think Edwin Morgan's quite conscious of the linguistic heritage of Scotland. I think he's playing around with that in his poem. But another thing that the Loch Ness Monster song is a nature poem. It's about a wild creature, albeit a fictional one. And that's a really important topic in Scottish literature and Scottish culture. If you think of Scotland, if you go on a website about visiting Scotland, you'll see many images like this. You'll see someone with tartan and bagpipes in a glen with the mountains behind. You'll see beautiful snow-capped hills. You'll see silent valleys like this. It's a real part of the brand of modern Scotland. It's part of the appeal of modern Scotland to visitors and to Scots. You know, people love to visit these landscapes, and they appear in movies and all the rest of it. And what's interesting is this appeal and people thinking of Scotland this way is pretty new. It's only the last couple of 100 years that people have found this a desirable thing about Scotland. Before that, people would have said, why do you want to go and see those mountains? You know, they're a hindrance, they're in the way, they're dangerous, there are bandits in them hills. And the reason that changed is largely down to this man here, Sir Walter Scott. I've already mentioned him for his historical novels. A lot of his writing, his fiction and his poetry is set in the Highlands of Scotland. It involves outlaws and bandits and heroic noble clan chiefs. He was a bestseller, by far and away the bestseller in the 18 teens and the 1820s, essentially worldwide, certainly in Britain, but worldwide. His reputation has very much fallen by the wayside. His style has really dated, but he was incredibly influential. People lapped up his books. They were a complete breath of fresh air after the Age of Reason, the kind of logical, scientific, dainty, precise literature and culture of the 18th century. His sort of more rugged writing was people couldn't get enough of it, and they flocked to the Highlands and Islands of Scotland to see these landscapes for themselves off the back of Walter Scott's writing. And such was his influence that this monument was completed after his death, funded by subscription. It's the biggest monument anywhere in the world dedicated to a writer. It looks a bit like a space rocket, I think. Or perhaps, you know, someone's broken a little bit off a Gothic cathedral and plonked it down in the middle of the city. This is right beside Waverley train station in Edinburgh, Waverley being named after Walter Scott's most famous novel and the character in that book. If you arrive in Edinburgh and get the train or the tram from the airport, this is one of the first things you'll see looming over you, a real mark of Walter Scott's influence in Scottish culture. I did include a slide, which I'll leave you to look back via the recording if you want, of Walter Scott's writing. It is quite long-winded, it's quite heavy going, I think. It's not how writers write now, but it's to give you a sample of how this kind of joyously over-the-top writing about mountains and rivers, waterfalls, beautiful women playing the harp while sitting beside the waterfall, all that kind of thing going on in this in this piece of writing. And this was popular at the same time that there were immense upheavals in rural Scotland. People were migrating to the cities, which were growing, and also emigrating abroad. Here's a little plan of Glasgow, biggest city in Scotland. This is it in 1783. It's just a few streets. If you look at the bottom right, you'll see High Green and Low Green. Those are parks in the centre of Glasgow. Now, let me show you just over 100 years later, in 1890, the sort of blue-green splodge to the right of this map are those green. So the city has expanded vastly in all directions over 100 years. This is a mark of its growth as well. From the very start of the 19th century, under 100,000 people in population, it was a small university and cathedral city. By the start of the 20th century, we're getting over 1 million. It was one of the industrial powerhouses of the British Empire. At the start of the 20th century, it's thought that a third of the world's shipping third of the world's commercial and military ships were built on the River Clyde in Glasgow. It was a real kind of industrial centre. And as all that stuff was happening, the appeal of rural writing with perhaps a simpler way of life, with escape to beautiful landscapes, that really took off, you know, alongside the urban growth and the urban squalor that was happening at the same time. Part of this process, there's the Industrial Revolution, there's migration, there's also an event called the Highland Clearances. I don't have time to talk about that just now, but I'm happy to discuss that in the questions if we want to go into that in a little bit more detail. Perhaps I'll finish up there. The last thing I want to say really is that the Loch Ness Monster song doesn't take itself too seriously, and I think that's a nice thing which is fairly typical of Scottish literature. The Scots like to have a laugh and a joke, sometimes, but not always, over a glass of whiskey, and they like to have a joke at themselves. They don't tend to take themselves too seriously very often. I think the Loch Ness Monster song is slightly making fun of its own history. That's something you'll see in another quote here, which I'll leave you to look at in a slide in your own time, from a contemporary novel. It's set at Culloden Moor, the site of the last battle on the British mainland, where the Jacobite Uprising in 1746 was defeated. This is from a contemporary novel by Alan Warner. He's basically making fun of this whole setting. He makes it into a Hollywood movie set where plastic mannequins are wearing kilts, and there are plastic mannequins of horses as well. The whole place is a bit surreal and a bit fabricated, a bit false, but it's making all the moves towards this great Celtic heritage. That cultural self-confidence, being prepared to make fun of yourself, I think that's something that Scotland has learned and is much more comfortable with now than it would have been a couple of generations ago. I think part of the reason for that is it's the Scottish Parliament, which was completed, well, the Parliament itself was established in 1999. This building, which houses the Parliament, was established a couple of years later. This is a devolved regional government for Scotland. Until 1999, Scotland conducted all its politics through London. Since 1999, it has a lot more autonomy over many things, to do with education, to do with health, particularly this year to do with COVID. And there's been a real difference between the way Scotland has tried to manage COVID and the UK government in London. An interesting thing, again, which I'm happy to discuss the dynamics of in questions if we have time. And let me just, as we go into questions, share a little bit further reading for anyone who's interested. Immodesty means I've mentioned my own book there. It's a literary travel guide to Scotland. There are a few other interesting books as well. Histories of Scotland, histories of Scottish literature. Scotland, the autobiography, is an interesting one because it's all sort of primary sources. It's all accounts of Scotland in the words of people who were there at the time. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for listening. And I really look forward to chatting with you a little bit over questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Gary. That was extremely informative and entertaining. So we've got a number of questions that were proposed during the session, and we see a couple more coming in. So let's start tackling them now.
Should I stop sharing the screen before we go on? Or
no, you could just, or yeah, actually, if you'd like, it's up to you. Then it'll just be our giant faces on the screen for everybody to see. So.
Okay. Well, okay. I'll do that. I'll take the plunge.
Yeah, okay. Devontae may force that hand anyways, but here we go. So just a real quick referential question back to the beginning. Can you briefly just indicate again, what was the name of the type of poetry? Going back to the very beginning.
Yeah, sound poetry is the name of it. So it's a lot of poets who avant-garde poets in Britain, in the US, I think in Brazil as well was one of the other centers of it, who wrote poems which are in made-up words. And the idea behind it is that you can get a lot of meaning just from the sound of words themselves. So it's a bit like if you imagine hearing a discussion through a wall in your house, even if you can't make out the individual words, you can kind of get a sense of whether it's an argument, a declaration of love, whatever. So people are exploring that in poetry. I've just seen a request for the reading.
Yeah, further reading, and I'll just say to everybody, I will, in the follow-up email that I send, I will include that list in there. So no need to scramble for a piece of paper and pencil at this point, but that will be in the follow-up email for sure. So okay. A couple questions in regards to wearing kilts, for example, anything to, so what is the history of men wearing kilts, and does it have anything to do with the bagpipes? And then tangentially, after the Gallic Uprising and many of their culturals were restricted, such as wearing tartans, playing the bagpipes, how long did it take to ease those restrictions?
Couple of really good questions there. Okay, and both of them take me back to Walter Scott, actually. Okay, so the history of the kilt, historically, before, well, so the Highlands of Scotland, the islands of Scotland, so the northern and western regions of Scotland and the islands had historically a lot of autonomy from the rest of Scotland. It took until, I think, James III, so that's the end of the 15th century, for the government in Edinburgh to get control over those regions. Until then, it's a bit like, rural Pakistan or rural Afghanistan. There was kind of warlords in the hills who could have their own fiefdom. And they were clans, and they weren't necessarily bad rulers of their own people. There was a kind of family bond there that, they would govern their people well, but a lot of their economy came from stealing cattle from further south, or from blackmailing the people of the lowlands and saying, we'll attack you unless you give us some money. And it was the Stuart kings, in the line that James IV and Mary Queen of Scots are in, that subdued the Highlands. They made the first maps of the islands on the west that were really accurate, so boats could get there to control that. And after, so they incorporated them more into Scotland. And then after the Jacobite Uprising, a lot of military roads were built by the London government, which was the government of the time, so that the army could get there, more easily and build forts and control that territory. Some of those roads are still where the highways are now in Scotland. So in those northern areas, people didn't have tailors. They didn't have shops where you could buy clothes or anything like that. So they would generally wear, a big piece of fabric that they'd throw over the shoulder. They'd wrap around them almost like a toga, kind of thing. And it would be in a kind of plaid pattern. It would have been dyed with, plant materials, that kind of stuff. And so that's the origins of the kilt, the deep origins of the kilt. People didn't wear them in the modern sense until the early 19th century. The Walter Scott arranged for King George the, forget which number, I think George IV, to visit Scotland in about 1820. It was the first visit by an English king to Scotland for many, for a couple of hundred years. He organized a big pageant, and as part of that, people wore tartan and they wore kilts. And at that point, it had kind of been out of fashion, but Scott is reviving this kind of old tradition from the Highlands and celebrating it and putting it kind of at the front of Scottish culture for the first time. So many of us, and me included, I should really have brought it on screen. If I've got time at the end, I can run downstairs and show you, bring up my kilt to show you. We all have a family tartan, different colors, different designs for different families. Organizations, football teams, that sort of thing have them now as well. Military regiments. But that actual tradition of having a distinctive family tartan only goes back 200 years, really. The prehistory of it is the dyed fabric in the Highlands, but then it goes back to Walter Scott's pageant. And Walter Scott, by the time he's doing that, so that's about 1820, that's 70 years after the Jacobite Uprising or so. By that time, we're a generation or two later, it's safe to do that. It's no longer a kind of incendiary revolution thing to be promoting Gaelic culture, because it's been so marginalized that they can afford to be sentimental about it and say it's kind of, I think, something of the past and something of our heritage, rather than a living, breathing culture that would be a threat to the mainstream. So it's an interesting thing. It's an interesting thing to get your head around, because many Scots are incredibly proud of their history and their culture, and they're incredibly proud of tartan, and many people wear kilts at weddings and formal occasions like that. You'll have seen the late Sean Connery would never miss an opportunity to wear his kilt, instead of a black tie tuxedo kind of thing. But there's an interesting tension there because, you know, a lot of that history came up in the 19th century once Scotland was no longer a separate country, you know, and its culture was a little bit restricted.
Okay, very good. Okay, a couple questions actually. You and I were talking about this prior to getting started, but do you think overwhelming Scottish opposition to Brexit will result in another independence referendum? And then similarly, what do you think is the likelihood of independence, Scottish independence?
Yeah, interesting questions, big questions everyone's talking about now. So there was an independence referendum in 2014, and 45% voted for independence, 55 against. And as soon as that happened, you know, a lot of people, the people that wanted to keep that, you know, Scotland as part of the UK, say, okay, that's us had that vote, that's it for a generation or however long that might be, you know, that's it settled. We don't want to open these wounds again, you know, and so on. Brexit kind of changed that quite a bit, I think. So Scotland, along with Northern Ireland, they were the two parts of the United Kingdom that voted, in Scotland's case, well over 60%, high 60s percentage, to stay in the European Union. The kind of anti-European sort of populism, I think, that was behind the Brexit campaign doesn't really stick in Scotland as much as it does in England. I think in England, there's much more of the history of being a rival country with France, going to war with France, that kind of thing. In Scotland, people don't tend to think like that, and you know, that's not their history, and not a history they're educated in at school. So I think there was, for that reason, there was less suspicion of it, and also people in favour of Scottish independence don't want Scotland to be a kind of isolated country on its own in the middle of the Atlantic with no allies. They want Scotland to be part of the European Union, you know, a bigger organisation. So it's not about breaking away from all organisations, just, you know, the United Kingdom. Yeah, I think Brexit has been one change in that. I think a lot of people, most people in favour of Scottish independence are in favour of being in the EU. There are many exceptions, but the majority want that. I think the big change recently actually has been, I sort of alluded to it briefly, is this year with COVID-19, the Scottish government has increasingly, so the sort of devolved Scottish government has increasingly gone its own way in how it's managing the virus and managing the sort of public health stuff. I think it's been much more, you know, I mean, a lot of people have died and it's not been a, you know, complete success, but I think they've seemed much more like grown-ups in the way that they make announcements about it and the logistics of it than Boris Johnson and the London government do. And I think it's interesting because it means that Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the Scottish government, who's from the Scottish National Party, they want Scottish independence, she's been on TV, you know, most days making health statements, you know, and explaining the state of lockdown or whatever. People have been able to directly contrast her with Boris Johnson, and even people who are by no means in favour of Scottish independence tend to say she's doing better. Really interesting thing. And this year, for the first time, the polls since June, I think, the polls in favour of Scottish independence have been pretty much consistently above 50%, or 58%. Will independence happen? I don't know. I thought when the no vote happened in 2014, I was pretty sure that in my lifetime, you know, touch wood, hoping that I live to a good age, I was pretty sure Scotland would become independent at some time within my you know, 70 years and 10. It felt like a real attitude shift, especially among younger people. The demographic voting against independence tended to be older, tended to be more socially conservative, tended to be people with less history of higher education as well. So it's interesting, you know, that's interesting demographics. It's not the people voting for Scottish independence. It's not a kind of reactionary right-wing kind of nationalism. It's a nationalism which is very, at pains to say, it's very inclusive, you know, that you're Scottish if you come to Scotland and want to become part of the country. It's a nationalism that wants to, you know, reach out to other small countries and be part of Europe. The other thing I said to Elizabeth before we started, it's really interesting, is a referendum on Scottish independence can only legally happen with the permission of the government in London. So, you know, they might want, the sort of pro-independence campaigns might want to force their arm and, you know, build up so much pressure that it has to happen. Otherwise, it's not very logical for London, if they want to keep Scotland in the UK, and they do. It's not very logical for them to like grant permission for another referendum at the moment. So fraught kind of thing. I think it'll happen, and I'm, as you might get a sense from the way I'm speaking, I'm in favour of it. But I don't know. I'll see. And incidentally, my wife, who's English, is from the south of England. She's probably even more passionately in favour of Scottish independence than I am. So it's interesting. There's a lot of English people in favour of Scottish independence who live in Scotland, and have embraced what they think is a slightly different society. You know, a lot in common, not rejecting everything about England, but like some of the things that Scotland does differently.
Okay. So actually there's two directions we can go. I'm going to go back in history because we have some questions about independence had it potentially occurred earlier. And then we also had some questions in regards to how Scotland's handling the pandemic. So I'll go back in time and then come to the present day. So let's go. Let's see. Do you think the relationship with the colonies would have been different if the Jacobites defeated the British government? Would the Stuarts have been as interested in having the colonies become part of the British Empire?
Really interesting question. Really interesting question. Well, first thing to say is I think Scotland becoming part of Great Britain in 1707, you know, there wasn't a popular vote on it or anything. It was the nobles, sort of powerful families and rich families of the country that made the decision to join with England. But Scotland benefited in purely economic terms. If you leave out the ethics of the British Empire, Scotland benefited a great deal from that. It suddenly had access to international trade that it didn't have before. Glasgow, I showed you the charts for the growth of Glasgow. That happened after the west coast of Scotland suddenly was able to trade with the Caribbean, with North America, with the world. So a lot of people, until the 20th century, most people in Scotland would probably unhesitatingly have said union into Great Britain was a really good thing for Scotland. It helped this country modernize. Scotland urbanized. I think it was one of the last countries in Europe to move from a rural to a more urban population. It did incredibly rapidly during this time. And it was only in the 20th century people started thinking about some of the differences between Scotland and England to do with politics, to do with culture, and sort of pro-independence grew out of that. Even 10 years ago, you'd have had about a third at most of people in Scotland being in favour of independence. It's really accelerated over the last 10 years. And maybe some of that's, you know, the divisions that many countries have had over politics in the last few years, and things have changed. The question with the Jacobites, that's a really interesting one. The empire would probably have been different. The people in favour of the dynasty that deposed the Jacobites or replaced the Jacobites tended to be the people who were more in favour of free trade with the empire, building a new economic order. Whereas the Jacobites, their support was mainly in the old families, the old aristocratic families, who quite liked a sort of fairly traditional status quo in terms of the way the economy was run. Perhaps that would mean they were slightly less imperial. But the empire had started by this time, you know, by Elizabeth I's time, you've Britain having settlements in what's now the United States. So that stuff would still have been there. Maybe it wouldn't have gathered steam as quickly, I don't know. The sort of real growth of the empire happened after the Jacobite Uprising had failed. So, you know, 18th, 19th centuries is when, you know, India becomes a sort of really tangible part of the British Empire, for example. Places like Australia are only just being, you know, that's after the Jacobites that's, I think, even discovered, let alone settled. Certainly the latter. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's really tantalizing for people to say, oh, things would have been different if the Jacobites had regained power. I think that's true. It would have been different, not necessarily better. I mean, James II was deposed in 1688, not just because of his Catholicism, but because he was trying to bypass Parliament and you know, was becoming increasingly authoritarian. So who knows? I think, you know, would have been different in some ways, some better, some worse. Britain, I think, would still have had an empire in order to compete with the other countries in Europe that were doing the same thing. And the Scots, you know, sometimes people think of the Scots as being sort of conquered by England, which is not the case. You know, we joined consciously with England, and Scotland, Scots were very involved in the British Empire. Part of that, an interesting thing, that Scotland had universal, high quality universal education earlier than England. That meant there were a lot more people who were not rich, who were highly literate and numerate and all the rest of it. Those people were really useful if you've got an empire. They can go and be the accountants and the lawyers on sugar plantations in Jamaica, that kind of thing. And Scots did that disproportionately. Scots were involved in all that stuff. And it's only, you know, half of the street names in the centre of Glasgow are named after people who made a huge amount of money from the slave trade, from sugar plantations, those kinds of things, which, you know, related to the empire. Some of those people had been failed Jacobites who, you know, went abroad, went to Jamaica for a few years, made their fortune, and then came back and were rich enough to get accepted back into high society. It's only the last few years I think hard about that heritage and think, you know, that's something to be honest about, and to realize the ways in which Scotland benefited from a really kind of sort of shameful process. Glasgow University, interestingly, is very recently tried to calculate how much money it got given in the 19th century by people who had made their fortunes from slavery and sugar and those kinds of industries, and is trying to do reparations based on, you know, thinking about that. So they've been setting up partnerships with universities in the Caribbean. They've been offering scholarships, that kind of thing. So that's an interesting thing. Scotland is very complicit and involved in the British Empire, and is only just starting to acknowledge that and think about that. And we'll see where that goes.
Okay. Well, good. Actually, you did answer it, because one of the questions was Scotland as a nation involved in the slave trade? And the answer is no, yes.
So
and
involved
actually,
involved in the sense of like powerful people being the kind of, you know, barons sort of making a fortune from, you know, in a very huge way from having plantations in Jamaica. A lot of Jamaica, a lot of places in Jamaica have very Scottish names, and a lot of people have Scottish ancestry or connections one way or other in Jamaica. Other places too, but Jamaica is a real centre of it. There's an interesting novel called Joseph Knight. It's by James Robertson. If I stop sharing the screen, I guess I can put this in the chat box and you can.
Yeah, and I'll make sure I send that out as well, so to everybody.
Yeah, so that's, I just typed Joseph Knight by James Robertson. So it's a historical novel published in the last 20 years about a black slave from Jamaica who was brought by his owner to Scotland. And there was a landmark court case. This is about the 1770s, I think. A landmark court case here where he wanted his freedom. And slavery was not legal in Scotland at the time, but it was legal in Jamaica for Scots to own slaves. So there was a landmark court case which he won, Joseph Knight won, and it was a sort of landmark part of the process of Scotland acknowledging and kind of rejecting slavery, I think, you know, and it was supported by a lot of people in Scotland, by no means all, you know, a lot of people were making money from slavery, but some of the funding that he got for his legal campaign is quite interesting. It's from a group of miners in Scotland, you know, as in coal miners, who were essentially sort of serfs almost, you know, owned by the person who owned the coal mine, a load of white miners, and they gave a whole lot of money to Joseph Knight's campaign, because they felt like they were in a similar situation to him in terms of just like what is you know, freedom. And it was almost forgotten about in Scottish history. This very, very kind of, you know, people didn't really know about it. James Robertson published a novel which has a lot of historical details. So if anyone's interested in reading more, that's a good place to turn.
And then shifting away from slavery. So this commenter writes that a while ago she read a book on the history of Scotland and that the Scots had a major influence on democracy and may have even been the first democratic society. Can you lend any insight into those claims?
Um, yeah, I think Scots would love to say that about themselves. There are some ways in which that's true. I don't think it's true in terms of elections and voting. I don't think, I mean, uh, Scotland didn't have, widespread suffrage in terms of voting in elections until the rest of the UK did in the early 20th century. So it's not true in that sense. It's true that people like Robert Burns were very inspired by the kind of Republican pro-democracy current in the late 18th century, the stuff that inspired the French Revolution and so on. And in turn, people like Burns influenced how people thought about freedom and democracy and equality. A lot of people, especially Scots emigres, were influenced by lines like Burns has a line, "A man's a man for all that," everyone is equal kind of sentiment. So that stuff you can find definitely in stuff like Robert Burns. It was democratic in the sense of education, partly because of the Reformation, which I've not really mentioned. The Reformation so the Protestant Reformation in England was largely a case of Henry VIII wanting to get divorced and breaking away from the Roman Church, Catholic Church, in order to, and putting himself at the head of the church in order to do that. A lot of the religious practice stayed pretty much the same. In Scotland, it was much more a grassroots change. It was local, you could say almost Republican democratic kind of structure. And they got rid of bishops, they got rid of hierarchy. Every parish had a kind of, a group of elders, a Presbyterian group of elders who would make decisions for that parish and hire a minister to be their minister rather than it being imposed by a bishop. That was sort of more democratic. That was going on from the 16th century. But alongside that, the people behind the Scottish Reformation, figures like John Knox, who was the kind of, John Calvin or something of Scotland, he was really in favor of mass literacy, everyone being able to read so they could read the Bible for themselves. That's a very Protestant idea. You don't just have the priest preaching to you. But he's therefore in favor of very widespread education. And Scotland, from that time onwards, had quite a democratic education system. It had a lot more people from all walks of life going to education. So that's one way in which I suppose you could say Scotland has sort of different kind of democratic thing. There's a few other countries in Europe will claim to have the oldest parliament. I think Iceland might say it has the oldest democratic parliament in the world, and maybe there's another country as well that would make a similar claim. But going back a while, when Scotland joined England, that wasn't in any way a democratic, thing. That was the powerful leaders of the country making a decision for everyone. So, there's pros and cons to it.
Okay. Well, and with that, we are actually approaching the bottom of the hour, and we've been at this for 88 minutes now. So thank you very much, Gary. Just a reminder to everybody who's tuned in, this presentation, we are recording it, so it will be available in our live stream archive on the MSU Alumni Office website within a week. I will be sure to include the link to that archive in the follow-up email, so stay tuned. We, for the questions that we didn't have time to address, I will be forwarding those to Gary, and he will be able to take a look at them, and if he is so inclined, he can respond to you individually in regards to those. Stay tuned. In the spring, we anticipate 2 more presentations, one on Robert Burns and Scottish literature, and the second on Scottish writers and Scottish independence, and Gary will be returning to us in that capacity. The dates and times are TBD, but since you did register for this presentation, you'll definitely receive notification about those 2 spring presentations. So with that, we hope you enjoyed today's presentation. When you exit out, there should be a survey that pops up on your screen. I understand it doesn't happen for everybody, but most of you should get a survey. So please take a moment to rate the presentation today and let us know how we did. And that's it. Thanks so much. Have a great day.